here, so I've got to make sure that I don't go over the top. Lady in the back had asked me about, I had a slide up there where Jesus wasn't wearing a prayer shawl, and I said, that's really typically the case. It's very hard to find pictures where Jesus is wearing one. And that kind of, proves the point. It really is, it's very unique. How many times in movies, when we were kids, you saw The King of Kings, or Ben-Hur, or Greatest Story Ever Told? Jesus is never depicted like that. He's never depicted that way in art and paintings, whether it's Michelangelo or whoever it is. You just never see Jesus depicted that way. Yet it's more than likely that that's what it would have been. Now, I want to go on and talk to you about Jesus for the next day and a half. We're going to talk about Jesus the Lamb. And then tomorrow night, we'll talk about Jesus the Lion. And that's, again, looking at the two roles in the Jewish sacrificial system. Now, this is, to me, one of the greatest things in art in the history of the world. Anybody tell me what this is? Do you recognize this with this up on the screen? The Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo. I personally believe that the greatest single thing that any human being has ever done, other than the Lord Jesus himself, was the painting of the Sistine Chapel. I'm stunned by it. I had an opportunity one time, believe it or not, I had a private showing of it. And I literally was in the Sistine Chapel with another 40 or 50 people. And we had literally rented the Sistine Chapel, the company that I was with. And I was with my 16-year-old daughter and my wife, laying on the floor of the Sistine Chapel, looking up at the greatest piece of art I think ever done. I told my daughter as we got in the elevator, she was 16, and I said, whatever happens the rest of your life, it's all downhill from now. She reminded me of her wedding. She said, no, that was fun. But I think it's the greatest piece of art. And what Michelangelo did is he captured much of the Old Testament. And these are very familiar images to us. Now here, of course, you have the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden. And you've got the angel with the sword casting them out of the Garden of Eden. Now let me ask you a question, folks. Is there anything wrong with this picture? Michelangelo, greatest artist I would say that ever lived, and yet he did something, he didn't look through Jewish eyes. There's something very definitely wrong with this picture. Anybody have any idea?
No clothes.
Naked, exactly, no clothes. Now why would we say that? Because it says in Scripture that they were clothed in skins. Now why is that important? Well, the skins that God used to clothe them, logically, I would argue, looking through Jewish eyes, is the first death ever recorded in history. Because God slew an animal or two to take those skins to cover Adam and Eve. Now, were Adam and Eve embarrassed? Were they ashamed because they were naked because somebody was looking at them? Certainly not. There was no one else in the world. It was just them. And they were husband and wife. And God was their creator, so they weren't embarrassed in front of him. They were ashamed of their sin. And what God did is he, from the very beginning, told them about the blood sacrifice, the blood atonement. He slew an animal to cover them, to cover their sins. They're covered with the skins, but I would also argue it was the blood of that animal. I like to think it was a scapegoat. We have no idea. But interesting to me that they were covered in these skins. It's the first death. And in Romans, we read from the Apostle Paul, sin entered the world through one man, Adam, and death through sin. And this way death came to all men. So immediately upon the moment that they're kicked out of the garden, God already tells Adam and Eve about how they're going to be saved. He promises them a redeemer right there in the garden. And it's all about the sacrifice, the atonement, the blood sacrifice. It's all about the blood. And of course, we know who that Redeemer would be, the Lord Jesus that would come many, many millennia later. So the Jewish sacrificial system, you could argue, began in the Garden of Eden with that first atoning death, with that first blood sacrifice. We know that it's followed up immediately because what happens with the two sons of Adam and Eve? It says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. That was the writer to the book of Hebrews. Abel's blood sacrifice. Remember, the two brothers, Cain and Abel, are told to make sacrifice to the Lord. Cain offers some kind of vegetation, fruits or vegetables, something that he had grown. But Abel was the one that had the proper sacrifice because he sacrificed, get this, a firstborn lamb. A firstborn lamb. He had the proper sacrifice. He knew that it was all about the atoning blood, the blood sacrifice. It says, now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of the flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Noah, the first thing Noah does when he comes out of the ark, we read that he builds an altar and sacrifices some animals to the Lord. Again, a blood sacrifice. It's all about the blood. Noah built an altar to the Lord and taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord told Noah, make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. What is pitch? What is pitch? Tar, bitumen, yeah, it was a coating or covering to seal it, right, to keep it waterproof. For obvious reasons, right, the ark, so it wouldn't take on water. Interestingly enough, you'd be the judge when you look through Jewish eyes. The actual word in the Hebrew that would be pitch or tar is the word kopher. Now, kopher in the Hebrew would be taken from the Hebrew noun kafar, which means to cover. In other words, in the noun form, it simply means a covering. However, it's also found in the regular Hebrew word for the atonement in the book of Leviticus. It's the first time the word atonement is ever used, and it's the same word, kafar. In essence, therefore, what we have is it's the first time that atonement is mentioned in the Bible, and it's the covering over the ark. The covering over the ark. In other words, to keep the waters of judgment out, just as the blood of the lamb provides a perfect atonement for the soul. It gets more intriguing than that, I think, in that I think it's interesting that the very first thing that Noah did after placing his foot on the newly restored earth is give thanks to God and reinstitute the blood sacrifice. It's the first thing he does. After all of this time on the ark, he gets on dry land now and he offers a blood sacrifice. My personal thought is that Noah might have also earlier sacrificed as the last thing he did prior to entering the ark. He sacrifices an animal before going in the ark. He sacrifices an animal when he comes off the ark. And we don't know that for certain, but there's a clue that may tell us that. Remember that the pitch was used to cover the ark and was symbolic of the blood atonement, and that the sacrifice, Noah clearly understood the need for sacrifice, as was evidenced by his actions when he came off the ark. It's therefore quite possible that he offered a blood sacrifice before entering the ark. It's only conjecture, but Noah may have even mingled the sacrificial blood with the pitch used to cover the ark as a prelude to the later Levitical practice of sprinkling blood upon the atonement cover of the, dare I say it, Ark of the Covenant. Noah understood that the nature of man remained sinful and that all of those who would follow and ultimately repopulate the earth would likewise need a Redeemer. He knew that it was all about the blood. Father Abraham, God's chosen man, he built altars all over Canaan, all over the Promised Land. Sacrifice, blood sacrifice, he did this repeatedly. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. And continuously throughout his travels, he builds altars to the Lord and sacrifices animals. Most incredible, of course, was the sacrifice, aborted sacrifice of his own son, Isaac. When he was told by God to sacrifice his beloved son, I'm a father, I can't even imagine the grief that he must have had. We're going to see tomorrow how that really plays out into Jewish life. But you have the firstborn son sacrifice, where you have Isaac going up the mount to be laid on the altar to be sacrificed. And of course, God stays his hand at the last moment. And then you had God's chosen man. This particular slide I'm particularly excited about. Does anybody know who this statue is? Statue of? This is Moses. This is Michelangelo's Moses. One of the greatest pieces of art, again, ever by the greatest artist. I was with a friend of mine in Rome one time. We walked into a church, had no idea what it was. It was called the Church of St. Peter in Chain. And they believed that they had the chains. Catholics always have icons that they believe are things that they have, some kind of things, a bone of a saint or something. And all their churches are to have some kind of relic. And they believed that they had the chains that bound Peter when he was in prison. So we're standing here looking at these chains in their altar. And I looked to the right and I couldn't believe it. Standing right there, and I had no idea it was this great statue of Moses. Just right there where you could just reach out and touch it. But Moses, again, God's promise, God's chosen man, and he reinstituted, again, the animal sacrifice. He had what we, for those of us that are dispensational, began the dispensation of the law, where he went up to Mount Sinai, and God gave him the Ten Commandments. It was the beginning of Judaism. It was the beginning of the sacrificial system. On Mount Sinai, Moses with the Ten Commandments. And of course, his brother becomes the first high priest. The whole Jewish Levitical system, the priesthood, the people who would enact the sacrificial system, who would do the sacrifice of the animals in the tabernacle and later within the temple. And the Levitical priesthood became an enormous thing. It actually had 24 different divisions or courses in the priesthood. And there were some 50,000 priests that we read about that would have typically been on duty working in the temple at a given time during the high festivals. The priestly service in the tabernacle or the temple and before the Ark of the Covenant was to be taken very seriously. They could never trivialize this. It was all about the blood, and they were to be very careful about how they administered the sacrifices. We read about Aaron's own sons who were killed by God because they trivialized the offering before the Ark. And they actually were burned up because they had done things that were, again, against God's commands. They trivialized the sacrifices. The sacrificial system was not to be taken lightly. It was all about the blood. Now, whatever God has intended for good, we know that Satan will always try to corrupt. And I would argue that what has happened throughout history, every society, every civilization in ancient times had blood sacrifice. Whether they were Greeks or Chinese or Mayans or Egyptians or Babylonians, everybody had blood sacrifice. But it wasn't atonement for sin. It was to try to appease evil gods. Satan had completely taken the sacrificial system, had corrupted it, and turned it upside down. I believe that what he did is he instituted, throughout all of these pagan civilizations, the idea that it was all about the blood, but the blood was an expiation of evil gods, and it was to take this blood and try to get these evil gods to give them favor, these bloodthirsty gods. You think about the Mayans, when Cortez took his Spanish soldiers into the Aztec capital, which is now Mexico City, they literally thought that they had entered hell, that they had somehow entered hell itself, because there was so much blood everywhere, because the Aztecs and the Mayans as well slew hundreds of thousands of people. Blood sacrifice, not animal sacrifice, but blood sacrifice. You have even to this day, there's sacrifices in all the pagan religions and the animistic religions in Africa. I was in Papua New Guinea. I was in a headhunter tribe. Everyone my age or older had been a cannibal. Blood sacrifice, pagan blood sacrifice, not for the forgiveness of sins, but so that they could get the power of the person that they killed and ate. Total perversion. Satan had totally perverted it. In my travels, I've taken pictures of various pagan altars that you see all over the world, whether it's Mayans or Chinese. Or the one up here is actually taken from the plains of Megiddo, an old Canaanite altar. They even had people taking their children and sacrificing them to Moloch. When you go near St. Louis, Missouri, there's the great Indian monster, Cuyahoga, I think it's called. And again, animals said they believe that human sacrifice took place there as well. The blood sacrifice, the Lord intended that man be saved by the atoning blood sacrifice of his only Son. Christ's blood is the only way to salvation. The Jewish sacrificial system was to point the way to the Messiah. It was a mikra, a rehearsal for the Messiah. The Jews don't realize this fully today, but it was what it was originally intended for. Satan then persuaded sinful men to spill innocent blood, human blood, in order to appease the wrath of evil, bloodthirsty false gods. Totally perverting it. From the very beginning, here I say again, it was all about the blood. Without the shedding of blood, the writer of the Hebrews said there is no forgiveness. So we know that the shedding of Christ's blood. Now, to me, one of the most baffling passages in Scripture is this one. Now, the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead. So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt, and he took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. Now, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. I thought, wait a minute, what's that? He goes through all this trouble of recruiting Moses at the burning bush. Moses is trying to get out of the mission, but God insists that he go. He goes off, gives him all these orders, and on the way, all of a sudden we have this passage that God is going to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, this was of course Moses' wife, cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it. Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, she said, so the Lord let him alone. At that time she said bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. Remember, Abraham was told that all of his descendants had to be circumcised. Of course, Moses was a descendant of Abraham. He was a Hebrew. And he apparently now is going to be killed because of this circumcision. But you notice who the circumcision is. It's the son. It's his son. It's Moses, one of Moses' two sons. So the question is, what's going on here? Why would God take him and want to kill him? Now, looking for Jewish eyes again, look at the previous passage. The Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, to paraphrase this, he's going to tell Pharaoh, I'm going to kill your firstborn son. But here now, why was he killing Pharaoh's firstborn son? Why did they have that ultimately, those 10 plagues? Because they were sinning. Because they were sinning. It was an affront against God. This was the way God finally got their attention, the 10 plagues. But Moses now, at the same time, we find out that his firstborn son is going to be slain because apparently he had done something wrong. He had not circumcised his son. The Lord sent Moses to Pharaoh to free Israel, God's firstborn son. For failing to obey, God would punish Pharaoh by slaying his firstborn son. Amazingly, Moses had also failed to obey God by neglecting to have his firstborn son circumcised. Now, from the context, it may be inferred that it wasn't Moses that was going to be killed, but it was Moses' firstborn son whom God intended to slay. We don't really get that from the scriptures. He was going to kill him. And then he talks about the firstborn son. People have read that he was killing Moses. I would argue it was the firstborn son that was going to be killed. Exactly the same penalty for disobedience that he was going to rain upon Pharaoh. Now, Zipporah immediately, with a very fast response, prevented God from exacting judgment and forcefully illustrated to Moses the great punishment to be brought upon Egypt. He actually saw that firsthand. Remember Zipporah's words, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, she said. At that time she said bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. In Hebrew, the word for bridegroom is hatan. In the Semitic word for the word, we find another meaning. So all these words have double meanings, don't they? It also means circumcised. Bridegroom and circumcised both come from the same root word, hatan. Circumcised and protected. In essence, Zipporah may have used a play on words suggesting you are a bridegroom of blood, protected by the blood. In other words, it's all about the blood sacrifice. It was circumcision that set God's holy people apart. It made them separate, holy, a separate people. It is all about the blood. Now remember that Zipporah touched Moses with the blood of protection. The Hebrew word here uses the same one for describing how the Israelites daubed the sacrificial blood on their doorposts. It's the exact same word. They daubed it with blood. Again, on the night that the angel of death passed over the houses that had the lamb's blood, the sacrificial blood that had been daubed on their doorposts. So looking through Jewish eyes, we have a biblical mystery here. Moses, after he had grown up, he went out. I'm just going to paraphrase what I'm reading this, but Moses went out And one day, as you know, he's going into where the slaves are building, the Hebrew slaves are building these monuments for Pharaoh. And he sees a Hebrew being beaten by one of the Egyptian taskmasters. And what does he do? You remember what he does, what Moses does to the Egyptian? He kills him. He kills him. And the next day he goes back and he tells these two Hebrews to stop fighting. And they say, what are you going to do? You're going to kill us like you did the Egyptian. So it's all out now that Moses had killed this Egyptian. And that's why he flees Pharaoh, because Pharaoh now is upset that he had killed this Egyptian. Now, the question would be, I always thought about this. When I saw Charlton Heston do this in the movie, I thought, well, why would Moses have done that? Why would he? He was the prince of Egypt. All he had to do was go and tell his taskmaster, hey, don't beat that guy. The guy would have done whatever Moses said. He was the prince. Apparently, that what we have here, and a lot of times in the movies it's depicted this way, Moses was actually where he was disguised as a Hebrew slave, that he was actually among them, so that this man didn't recognize him as the prince of Egypt. Why would he do that, though? The question is, why did Moses, the prince of Egypt, secretly kill an Egyptian in order to help a Hebrew? From the text, Moses knew that the Hebrews were his own people, that they were his own people. Now, he's the prince of Egypt, brought up as the prince of Egypt. Everybody thinks he's the prince of Egypt. But he knows that the Hebrews are his own people. How did Moses know that he was a Hebrew? Did someone tell him? How do you think he knew? Simply put, Moses knew that he was a Hebrew because he was circumcised. He knew that he was a Hebrew from day one, as soon as he was old enough to realize the difference. I would argue that his mother, at least his surrogate mother, the princess that pulled him out of the Nile, would have had him fully clothed whenever he was in contact with anybody, because they would not want it to be known that he was a Jew, that he was a Hebrew. This is why he knew, and it was an amazing thing that this was a deception that they were able to keep until that time when he slays the Egyptian taskmaster. But again, he knew it was all about the blood. I want to just add what I think is a brick through a plate glass window when we talk about the sacrificial system. The Jews had a place called Migdal Eder. Migdal Eder in the Hebrew means the Tower of the Flock. This was the place where the Jewish temple priests kept the temple lambs, the temple flocks. There were tens of thousands of them killed on a monthly basis throughout the Jewish religious year. 250,000 killed just at the Feast of Passover. And they had to keep these lambs, they had to be without blemish, they had to be perfect. So what the temple shepherds did is they had a place that they called Migdal Eder, which was a tower called the Tower of the Flock, where they would watch the sheep, the temple sheep, the lambs without blemish, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. The sacred temple flocks were used for the daily sacrifice. Now this guard tower was erected to keep away beasts, wild animals, and of course any kind of thieves or marauders that might come and upset the flock. These thousands and thousands of sheep. Temple shepherds, as I said, guarded this thing continuously. These sheep were always being observed. Now, an ancient Aramaic interpretation called the Targum suggested, this is before the time of Jesus, suggested that when the Messiah came, his arrival would first be announced at Migdal Eder, the Tower of the Flock. Now, they got this from some passages in the book of Micah. As for you, O watchtower of the flock, Migdal Eder, as for you, O watchtower of the flock, O stronghold, hill of the daughter of Zion, the former dominion will be restored to you. Kingship, the king, will come to the daughter of Zion. That's Micah 4:8. Now, in the very next chapter of Micah, we read this. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. He will stand and shepherd his flock, and he will be their peace. In other words, the Messiah, the shepherd, would come from Bethlehem. Now, Migdal Eder, the Tower of the Flock, believe it or not, is located in Judea, less than 1,000 yards from, you guessed it, Bethlehem. Now think about the significance of this. The temple shepherds may be the ones that the angels came to on the night that Jesus was born. Migdal Eder is situated right there at Bethlehem. And how poignant is that? How poignant is that? If the birth of the Messiah, where the Jews believed that the Messiah would first be announced at Migdal Eder, is actually announced to the temple shepherds who are keeping the flocks that no longer need to be sacrificed. Because the Messiah, the Lamb of God, is sleeping less than 1,000 yards away in a stable. You look through Jewish eyes, doesn't that come alive? I mean, I hope it does. These are things that you just normally would never pick up from the text. The temple shepherds. I think that's a lot. I hope that you feel that as well. So what does John the Baptist say when he sees Jesus? Behold the what? The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Behold the Lamb of God. So looking through Jewish eyes, what we have then is Jesus clearly was this lamb in the Jewish sacrificial system. Is this the next? No, okay. We have to take a second to switch over. Okay. Thank you very much. So Jesus the Lamb. Now the spring festivals, as I said a moment ago, were Pesach or Passover, Hag HaMatzah, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Bikurim, which is the Feast of First Fruits, and Shavuot, which, believe it or not, we call Pentecost. But it's a Jewish holiday. Pentecost is a Jewish holiday in the book of Leviticus. It's one of the 7 sacred convocations. And we know Pentecost in the Christian church, but again, it's a Jewish convocation. I would argue, again, these are rehearsals, mikra, for Christ's first coming. Now, Paul apparently believed this because what Paul said to the Corinthians is, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. He understood the connection. Now, at the time of Jesus, Passover, Pesach at the time of Jesus, was an incredibly high point in the Jewish year. All of the Jews were required to go up to Jerusalem. Up to Jerusalem made Aliyah, in Hebrew, Aliyah, going up to Jerusalem 3 times during the year. They had to go the week of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They had to go up the week of Shavuot, Pentecost, and they had to go up during the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall. All Jews were required to do this. When Jesus goes up at the age of 12, it says after the custom of the feast. The custom was all of the Jews went up at the time of Passover. This is the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, which is the last part standing of the original temple complex. Now, the Roman historian Tacitus actually claimed that there were 600,000 people that lived in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. Now, I find that hard to believe. I live in Milwaukee. There's 600,000 people in the city of Milwaukee. And for me to think that little Jerusalem at that time had that many people, but the Romans were usually pretty accurate in their numbers. That's why they had these censuses all the time. And he claimed that there were 600,000. Josephus, the Jewish historian, also said that there were over 500,000 Jews that lived there. They also both believed that at Passover, during the high holidays, the numbers would swell upwards to 2 million people, at least 1.5 million to 2 million people, because all the Jews would come up to Jerusalem for the holidays. Up to Jerusalem because Jerusalem's in the high country. When you come up the Jericho Road, you're going literally up, straight up to Jerusalem. Everybody goes up to Jerusalem. But the Jews were required to go up, as I said, 3 times during the year. And those visitors from outside the city were required to arrive 7 days before this festival because they had to become ceremonially purified. So if you went up to Jerusalem for Passover, you had to go up 7 days early to be purified before you could actually be involved in the Passover celebration. Now, meanwhile, the inhabitants of the holy city prepared for Passover by thoroughly spring cleaning their homes and possessions. Now, when your wife tells you to spring clean the garage, you can blame the Jews because they invented spring cleaning. Okay, I always tell my wife, it's a Jewish thing. Get a Jewish guy to clean the garage. And it's all about getting purified, ceremonially clean for Passover. Now, this is something that struck me one time as I was reading this. You be the judge. I think, again, looking through Jewish eyes, some of these things jump out that I think oftentimes we miss as Gentiles. In the weeks prior to the great festivals, the Jericho Road up to Jerusalem was thronged with traffic. All these pilgrims were going up to Jerusalem for the ceremony. All the Jews had to do this. So the beggars lined the road, all of the beggars, because they knew there were going to be all these tremendous amount of pilgrims, and they would then line up trying to get alms. And they would try to appeal to the vast group of pilgrims. Now, on the Jericho Road in Jerusalem, we read the story of Bartimaeus, blind Bartimaeus. In the journey up to Jerusalem, this was Jesus' last Passover before his crucifixion. This is now, he's going up, not only for Passover, but to be crucified. On the week prior to going up, the Lord was met by a blind beggar called Bartimaeus, which was not his actual name. Bartimaeus is what we call a patronymic. He's named after his father. He's Bar-Timaeus, son of Timaeus. An example of that is Nathaniel. You never see Nathaniel and Bartholomew again. Nathaniel's in the book of John. Bartholomew's in the Synoptic Gospels. They're never together. They're like Superman and Clark Kent. Well, the reason is the same guy. His name is Nathaniel Bar-Tomai, son of Tomai. Bartholomew is the Greek version. You see that? So this is Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. That's the way we know him. The name Timaeus came from the Hebrew word tameh, meaning ceremonially unclean or defiled. In other words, his name is, he's the son of uncleanness, or the son of defilement. I would take that for a name. And you're blind on top of it. Pretty good deal. Now, looking through Jewish eyes, look at the faith of Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus immediately is told that Jesus is coming. He's blind. He doesn't know. He can't see, but he knows his uproar. And immediately what does he do? He yells out, "Hail, son of David," the term for the Messiah. Hail, son of David. He recognizes in his blindness that Jesus is the Messiah. And he casts away his beggar's cloak. This is an example of a beggar, even today in Israel. And he would have his beggar's cloak laid out, and that was, it did two things. It showed that he was a beggar. And that's what people would lay their money, their alms on. And at night, that was his only source of warmth and security. That was his blanket. That's what he would use to cover himself. That was his sole possession, his beggar's cloak. Bartimaeus cast his aside. His sole possession, his sole means of warmth, and the very identification that he's a beggar. Because he's so convinced that Jesus is going to heal him. Amazing faith. It is by this act of faith, believing that Jesus would heal him, and that henceforth he would need to beg no more, that Bartimaeus is cured and purified. Now think of his name. He's the son of defilement, the son of impurity. It's interesting that on the week prior to Passover, when visitors to Jerusalem were required to become ceremonially purified, Jesus meets a guy called the son of uncleanness, the son of defilement, and heals and purifies him by forgiving his sins. It was probably the blind man's first chance to go up to Jerusalem and celebrate the Passover in a very long time. Isn't it amazing when you look at the words through Jewish eyes? I hope it does. There's things that, again, as Gentiles, I think that we miss. So Jesus the Lamb. They would select the lamb. Moses was told that the Jews were to select the Passover lamb on the 10th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, or Nisan. Nisan is equal to our late March, early April. Passover always takes place on the 14th day of Nisan, is the day of preparation. The 15th starts the 7-day long Feast of Unleavened Bread. So this is now the 10th day of the month that the Jews were to select the Passover lamb. And they were to observe it for 4 days to make sure that it was a lamb without blemish, that it was a pure lamb that they could then sacrifice for the Passover. Typically, they would get it from Migdal Eder, where the lambs were kept by the temple shepherds. Now, during the week prior to Passover, the Jews would clean everything. And what they were trying to do was get leaven, yeast, out of their homes. Leaven was to signify sin. They were to eat bread made without yeast, bread made without leaven. And this was to be, this unleavened bread was to signify bread made without yeast. Tomorrow in church, when we have communion, I'm going to talk to you about, I have the privilege of talking to you about how this actually epitomizes the Lord's Supper. The night that Jesus was betrayed, he was giving, the Lord's Supper was a Passover Seder. That was the Passover. He was actually having a Passover Seder with his disciples. He said, I long to eat this Passover with you. Tomorrow we're going to look at Holy Communion through Jewish eyes. But what they would do is they would clean everything. And in the Hebrew, the word for yeast is chametz. Chametz. And this was sin. They were trying to get it out of their homes. Now remember when Jesus, one of the things that they would do is they would also paint their homes white. They would whitewash their homes. They would whitewash everything to make it look clean and pure for Passover. And they would even whitewash the tombs. Part of it was to make it look clean and pure for Passover. And the other was they would paint them bright white so that no one would accidentally touch one in the week prior to Passover, because then it would become ceremonially unclean. If these pilgrims that were coming would accidentally step on a tomb, they might be, again, defiled right before Passover. Now remember when Jesus, on that week before Passover, he's on the Mount of Olives, and he's talking to the Pharisees, and he says to them, you're like whitewashed tombs. You're pure looking and clean on the outside, but rotten and defiled on the inside. Now, do you think they were happy with that? Well, certainly not. We don't need to be Jews to realize they were being insulted and chastised for their hypocrisy. But think about it through Jewish eyes. Jesus was standing on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives, then and now, is a giant graveyard. It overlooks the Temple Mount. You're overlooking the Kidron Valley. This is the Mount of Olives. That's the Temple Mount. That's where the temple stood. Today it's the Islamic Dome of the Rock, which is the third holiest shrine in Islam. But that's where the temple was. This is the Mount of Olives, where Jesus would have overlooked the city. And it's a big graveyard with whitewashed tombs. And down below is the Kidron Valley. You go down the valley and up then on the other side. Now think about Jesus standing there. It's Passover week. And he says to the Pharisees, "You hypocrites, you're like whitewashed tombs." And he's pointing out all these Jewish guys who are painting the tombs while he's saying that. And they would have got it right away. They would have realized that they were being severely chastised as hypocrites because they were not pure, even though they were pretending to be ceremonially pure. Spring cleaning. To this day, the Jews totally clean everything in their house prior to Passover, trying to get the leaven, the yeast, out of their house. And they clean it and get it ready. Of course, they're very happy to do this. They get you and Cleaver to come and take care of their pearls. They have spring cleaning. They get everything that has yeast products out of their house. This would be things like, obviously, bread yeast. I mean, that certainly would qualify. All of the yeasty breads and cakes and pies that they would have, donuts, whatever. They would even get out certain cosmetics, because some cosmetics actually have yeast in them. All the products that they could find, and they actually are told by the rabbis what this list of products would look like. I have a dog, some of you do. There's brewer's yeast for your dog. They had to make sure they had that out of their house. Even beer, believe it or not, if the Jews were drinking beer, they had to make sure that was out of their house, because beer is made with yeast. You know, less filling, no chametz. So they had to make sure that that was taken out of their house as well. Now, what they do, and they do this to this day, and they did this at the time of Jesus, is they would have, on the night before the day of preparation, on the 13th day of the month of Nisan, is they would then have a ceremony with the house where the father would check to make sure that his house was clean and purified for Passover, so that they could celebrate it the next day. The mama and the children would have been cleaning the house inside all week. Papa would have been cleaning the outside. But now he has to come in and he has to pronounce, and he searches the house. And what he does is he takes 4 items. This is actually taken off the internet. This is for sale. Every year the Jews buy what they call a Bedekatz kit, a search for chametz. And what it encompasses is 4 things. They have a candle, a wooden spoon, a feather, and a white linen container. And what they do is the mother takes 10 pieces of crusty bread that has yeast in it, and she hides them with the children at 10 places in the house. She has to remember where they are, because if she forgets, they forget to find one later. They're in real trouble, because they can't celebrate Passover. So the kids are very excited. Papa now is going to come home, and he's going to inspect the house to see that there is no chametz. And what he does is he takes the candle, he lights the candle, because it says in the Talmud that you have to have a candle, because you can get into all the corners. So they literally have a candle. He takes the feather, because if he finds a piece of chametz, he cannot pick it up with his hand. He'll be ceremonially unclean. So he takes the feather and he feathers it into the wooden spoon. And then he takes the wooden spoon and he dumps the chametz into the white napkin. So this is a way that they would do it. And he searches around. And of course, they know in advance that there's going to be these 10 pieces of bread that he's going to find. The kids are very excited. They're going, oh, you're getting warmer, you're getting colder. You can just imagine how excited they would be. And finally, he finds each one. He goes, oh, like that, chametz. And he goes and he takes his spoon and he spoons it into the with the feather. And they take these 10 pieces of bread. Why do you think it's 10? It's always 10 that they hide. Why 10 pieces of bread? Anybody have any idea who a Jewish is? The 10 Commandments is for each of the 10 sins. So what they're trying to do is make sure that they rid their house of all of these sins. And then when he finally finds the 10th one, and Mama breathes a sigh of relief because she remembers where they all were. Then he does, his house has no longer got any sin in it, any chametz. And he then pronounces to the children and to his wife, now our house is ready for Pesach, for Passover. And he takes this linen napkin, this white linen, if you would, this container, with this 10 pieces of bread, this sin of their family, and they take it outside of the house. It has to be outside of their house overnight. And then the next morning, on the day of preparation, the 14th of Nisan, he takes the bread and he burns it at 9 o'clock in the morning. The Jews all do this. They don't know why they do it at 9 in the morning, but they all do. Now, let me think about this. Think about this for a minute. It's the 14th day of Nisan, the day of preparation. It's at 9 in the morning, the third hour. What happened on that Passover when Jesus was crucified at 9 in the morning? That's when he was nailed to the cross. Jesus, the sin offering, is nailed to the cross at 9 in the morning. It says the third hour, which by reckoning would have been from 6 a.m., which is the first hour in Jewish reckoning. The third hour would have been 9 a.m. And that's the time that the Jews burned the sacrifice on that same day, the day of preparation. Now, I was giving this talk one time, and a lady came up at the break. So let me get this right. It was Passover week when Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple. He was cleaning his father's house of chametz. I thought how marvelous it was, so I made sure I had a slide of that. Literally, what he's doing is he's turning the evil, the sin, out of his father's house. So the 14th day of Nisan also was the the fast of the firstborn. The firstborn son in every Jewish family was told to fast on that day in honor, again, and remembering the fact that the firstborn in Israel were saved at the Passover when the firstborn in Egypt were killed. Now, isn't it interesting that on this same day, Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach, God's firstborn and only son, was himself slain to take away the sins of the world. Now, Passover always has the same elements. Whether you're having Passover in New York, or Passover in Jerusalem, or Passover in Moscow, it's always celebrated exactly the same way. The word Seder means order in Hebrew. There's a specific order that they do everything. And this is the elements that you would find. I'm going to do this very quickly. And the first slide that I always put up is these are U.S. Marines, but they're Jewish U.S. Marines. Jewish by religion, celebrate Passover on the USS Tarawa. I always put this up to remember both our service people, but also to show that no matter where you are, anywhere in the world, Jews are celebrating the Passover. Here's an example of this. Who knows where these men are deployed to? Now, the Jews always wear these vestments. Of course, here's this man wearing his prayer shawl. We talked about that. He's got a talit, or a yarmulke, or a kippah on his head. He's wearing a kitel, which is a white robe. They always traditionally would wear white, the presider, the papa, and the nuclear family at the Passover. We talked about the talit already. They would have a Seder table, where this was the absolute high dinner of the year. Mama brought out the best of everything, the best cutlery, the best china, the best glassware, stemware, and it was always the best white, always a white, linen tablecloth that was cast over. It was the very best of everything. In our house, Thanksgiving dinner is the big dinner of the year. This would be their Thanksgiving. There was always a ceremonial candelabra, traditionally, which was 3 candlesticks on one stand. A ceremonial 3-stick candelabra. Then they had the Haggadah, which is called the Book of the Telling. This is the order, or the Seder, and everywhere that they have the Passover, they use the same words to do the Passover. It's the order of things that happen. It's the order of when they drink the cups of wine, when they break the bread, all of the different things that they do, and it's all set forth. There's even the time, it tells how they're supposed to, the prayers that they're supposed to use as they do each day. It's like in a Catholic church or a high Protestant church, it's like a liturgy, for those who didn't experience that. They always have cushions, pillows for reclining. And we read about that in Exodus, how they had to stand there at the first Passover, standing with their robes wrapped around them and their staff in their hand to be ready to move out at a moment's notice when Pharaoh let the people go. But now they are reclining in comfort, and they have these cushions to prove that they're no longer slaves. They have the ceremonial hand washing kit for the archatz, which is the ceremonial washing of the hands, not just for cleanliness, but it has some specific messianic meaning as well. And then they have the Seder plate, which has the 6 symbolic foods. They don't eat these, but they're symbolic and they're on each Seder plate. They have the Zerah, which is an unbroken shank bone of a lamb. They have the Baitza, which is a roasted egg. It's not a boiled egg, it's a roasted egg. When I do Passover Seders, I do them every year, messianic ones. I roast my egg for 3 hours at 250 degrees. It comes out like a rubber ball. You literally can bounce it. My dog one year got it, my Zero, my lamb bone, and ate it while we were out shopping, and ate the egg too. I didn't know what to do. Now she survived it, but she did. Then they have chazaret, which is bitter herbs. Typically it's romaine lettuce or a stalk of horseradish. Maror, which is more bitter herbs, which is ground horseradish. Karpas, which is parsley or green onion. And then they have something called harissa, which is a mixture of chopped apples, nuts, wine or juice, and it's mixed together, kind of like a pasty applesauce kind of looking mixture. And they're all on this plate that everybody looks at because it has symbolism at the Passover. They have bitter herbs, and each Jew has a cup of salt water that they are to dip the bitter herbs in at a specific time during the ceremony. And then, of course, they have unleavened bread. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They have matzahs. Matzahs, unleavened bread. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow during the church service. We also have what they call a matzah tash, which is something that dates back to the time of the Hasmonean kingdom, the time of the Maccabees, 150 years before Jesus. When Jesus had the Last Supper, he would have used a matzah tash. I'll explain that tomorrow. It wouldn't have looked like this. This is obviously a very ornate one. But it's a tradition that would have dated back prior to the time of Jesus. And then they had 4 cups of wine that they drank specifically at 4 different times during the ceremony. Very specific, and each cup had a name, which I'm going to share with you tomorrow. They have Elijah's cup. If you're going to have a Passover dinner, and you have 12 people coming for dinner, you would set 13 places. If you have 19 people coming for dinner, you would set 20 places. I'll bet you know if you had 4 people coming for dinner, how many places would you set? You'd set 5. There's always a place set for Elijah because the Jews believe that at some Passover in the future, Elijah is going to come. Because the very last sentences in the book of Malachi are before the great and terrible day of the Lord, I will send you the prophet Elijah. Remember I said the big finish? The very last words that God gives his chosen people, the very last words of the last book of the Old Testament is about Elijah coming. They have what they call the Passover Guide. Every year, the Jews have a Passover Guide which is published for that year. It explains such things as to how to dispose of different things, how to clean your microwave, how to do all these things to be ready for Passover. It has the time zones, what time you're supposed to light the ceremonial candles. I live in Wisconsin, and it would tell you, I know we're Viking territory, but it would tell you what time sundown would be in Green Bay, and it would be different in Milwaukee and different in Madison. And all those times were literally in there so that you would know exactly what time to light the candles, and you would not be off, even by a minute. Everything very specific, and everything having meaning. And then they would say to each other, Chag Sameach, Chag Sameach, kind of like spit it out of the back of their mouth, and it's Happy Holidays in Hebrew. Now the Messianic fulfillment is, I think, startling when you look at it. For Christ, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. 1 Corinthians 5:7, Paul wrote that. Now, why do you think the Jews would use a white linen tablecloth? Can anybody see any Messianic symbolism in a long white linen tablecloth? I would argue Christ's white linen burial shroud. This is the way the Jews buried. They would wrap you in a shroud. You would be laying, you can see he's laying on it and it's folded over his head. It's exactly the same way as the Shroud of Turin. I'm not here to argue tonight whether that's really the burial shroud of Jesus, but it's exactly the way the Jews buried. The man demonstrated, the man on the shroud, is exactly the way a crucified body would have looked, and that's exactly the type of burial shroud that Jesus would have had. The tallit we've already talked about. As I said, they date back to Moses' time, and Jesus would have actually worn one. I'm going to go through this because I don't really have the time to go through this in detail. Lighting the candles. Now remember I said that they had these 3-stick candelabra. What they believe is that it is for the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know that that's not the case at all. Why would you have 3 in 1? 3 candles on one stand. 3 in 1, a triunity, a trinity, of course. And of course, Jesus is the light of the world, John 9:5. The arhats, where they ceremonially wash their hands. Jesus didn't just wash his hands on the night of the Passover. He washed the feet of his disciples. Remember, Peter says, then wash all of me, because I need all of your cleansing. And we know that within hours of Jesus doing that, what happened? On the morning that he's crucified, Pontius Pilate tries to wash the blood from his hands, the arhats. Salt water and bitter herbs. At the specific time of the ceremony, everybody takes parsley and they dip it in the salt water and then they eat it. And it's to denote the tears of the people, the Jewish people in bondage, eating these bitter herbs, the bitterness of their suffering, and then the salt being their tears. I would argue what it is Jesus in the story that is the great, smallest passage of Scripture, Jesus wept. the smallest verse in all the Bible, Jesus wept. Remember the story, what happened there? Of course, it's at the death of Lazarus. And Jesus comes, Lazarus has been dead for three days, it's the fourth day. And the Jews believed that the spirit hovered around the body for 3 days. So if you were in the tomb for 3 days or longer, then you were truly dead. Well, he waited to come until Lazarus was clearly dead. Remember, it says Jesus wept. Mary and Martha come out and they're crying, and Jesus wept. And they say, see how he loved him. So people would gather from that Jesus is crying because he's mourning his friend. I don't accept that. I don't accept that when I look through Jewish eyes. Jesus knew that in 5 minutes he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He wasn't mourning Lazarus. They were going to be happier than if he hadn't died at all. They were going to see Lazarus be raised from the dead. The important thing is that Lazarus died again later. Lazarus is dead now. Even though he was raised from the dead, some years later he died again. The only important thing is where he's spending eternity, and that, of course, is with Jesus in heaven as a saved believer in Christ. I believe that what Jesus was crying over was the human condition. That there even had to be death, because he didn't create us for death, he created us for life. The fact that sin had entered into the world, and again, it was all about the blood, and he had to come as the sacrifice. The very fact that he had to leave his throne in heaven and come and die for us, I believe that's why Jesus wept over the human condition. The roasted egg, the bites of it. This is what they look like when they come out of the oven. And they're speckled and like a rubber ball. Jesus, when he came to Jerusalem, he yelled out in a loud voice, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered together thy children as the hen doth gather her chicks under her wings? The Heraset, the Jews actually believe that this is to depict the mortar for the bricks when they made the bricks for Pharaoh. Remember that they were to take the straw and they were to get the mortar set up so that they could use it to build their bricks. And Pharaoh then told them they would have twice the requirement of mortar, and they wouldn't have any straw provided. They were gleaning from the fields. So they had twice the labor, twice the toil. Well, they make this Heraset is to the Jews, it's to represent the mortar for the bricks. The mortar for Pharaoh's bricks, but we remember the passage, Christ is our cornerstone. It's really to depict the Messiah, the cornerstone. They had what they called the Korek, the Hillel sandwich. Hillel was the high priest at the time that Jesus was born. He had the greatest rabbinic school in all of Jerusalem. And he was also, he lived until the year 10 A.D. And he was there when Jesus was born, at the time of his birth. I would argue, it's my understanding when I read about him through Jewish eyes, he's probably the man that Herod the Great went to and says, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? When the wise men come and inquire about Bethlehem. Because he was the wisest man. He was the one that was the head of the Sanhedrin. I also think that he met Jesus. And what he did is, first of all, I'm jumping ahead of myself, he made this sandwich out of broken matzah and these bitter herbs and this haraset, this applesauce mixture to be eaten together. And what it was to depict that they were no longer in bondage but were free men. And they would have done this at the time of Jesus because he died some years prior to Jesus' last Passover. I already said about all this. Well, he founded this great rabbinic school, and I think that he actually was the guy, not only that Herod inquired about the Messiah, but I think he met Jesus without realizing. I think he would have been in this Sanhedrin when Jesus, at the age of 12, went and just baffled those great elders and the great chief priests in Israel, because he was the top guy. He was the head of all of them. It would have been an amazing thing, because his grandson is Gamaliel. Gamaliel's grandson is the one that Paul studies under in the book of Acts. And Paul is the salutatorian of Gamaliel. Gamaliel, I'm just going to fast forward to it. Gamaliel actually is the one that very wisely says when they bring Peter and John to be whipped, he says, let these men go, because if they're not from God, what they speak is going to disappear on its own. But if they are from God, you're going to be fighting against God. Paul was his prize student. There's a tradition in the church, although we don't know if it really happened, but there's a tradition that he went back and tried to convert Gamaliel when he found the Lord. Kind of would make sense, to go back and tell your old mentor, the greatest scholar in Judaism, about Jesus. We have no idea whether that actually happened or not, but that's something that the scholars believe. Again, for the sake of time, I need to do this, but I just want to get ahead of this. We talk about Jesus dipping the sun. dipping the sop. Remember he handed it to Judas at the Last Supper? He dipped the sop. And there's this understanding that people think, well, he took this piece of bread and he scooped out meat and he handed it to them. That's the way they would eat. But this was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Unleavened bread doesn't scoop very easily for sopping out meat or juices out of a communal bowl. What they did, the Jews had a tradition that what you would do is you would take the Hillel sandwich, the korek that would have this carousel on it, this mixture of nuts and apples and wine, and you would give it to the most honored guest. If that's the case, that is what he would have used. The actual Greek word is morsel. He dipped the morsel. And it sounds like what he actually was doing was taking the harissa and giving it as the most honored friend to Judas. And Judas, in his hypocrisy, accepts it. But then he realizes Jesus says to him, do quickly what you have to do. So here's this man that's going to betray him, and Jesus honors him by giving him this morsel. It's amazing. It's so poignant, I think, when you look at it through Jewish eyes. The place for Elijah, well, again, echoing these last words, I believe that what we're talking about in Messianic is Moses and Elijah come and they see the risen, the glorified Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus talked about how Elijah had come as John the Baptist, as a type of Elijah. So there's all kinds of Messianic significance with the coming of Elijah. And of course we know that before the great terrible day of the Lord, Elijah will come back. I believe that Moses and Elijah, as I argued a year and a half ago when I was here, are actually the two witnesses. We're going to talk about that at the end of the session tomorrow night. The lamb without blemish, the Paschal lamb, had to be selected on the 10th day of the month. What the high priest would do is he would select the ceremonial Passover lamb on the 10th day of the month. We know that that 10th day of the month was Palm Sunday, the 10th of Nisan. We know that that would have been on the day that Jesus entered Jerusalem as the Lamb of God. Now, when the high priest would bring the lamb through the gates, the people would yell out, Hosanna, God save us, Hosanna to the Lamb of God. And here's Jesus all of a sudden comes in on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecy. And here he's coming through and the people are yelling out Hosanna to Jesus. You can imagine how the high priest and the priests were upset about this. He's upstaging their great scene, bringing the lamb through the gates because the true lamb had come. All the lambs, thousands of lambs were being paraded through the gates on that day. Taken to the temple for the sacrifice 4 days later. And the people would be watching it. Again, Palm Sunday. Selecting the lamb on the 10th of Nisan. Passover lamb had to be a firstborn male without defect. None of the bones were to be broken. It had to be eaten whole. And it had to be slain the 9th hour at 3 in the afternoon on the day of preparation, the 14th day of Nisan. Again, as we said, behold the Lamb of God. John the Baptist knew that Jesus was the sacrificial lamb in fulfillment of the promise made in the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve. Now, I think I'm going to close with this. I'm a little bit behind the time, but I know we're getting late. But I think this is kind of an amazing thing to do the judge. Remember we talked about Abraham and his sacrifice of Isaac. And it was his firstborn son. It was his beloved son, his firstborn son. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. And God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set off to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father, yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. God will provide the lamb. Now think about this. Here's Isaac, his son, who takes the wood on his shoulder, carrying it up the mount. Remind you of anything? God's firstborn son, taking the wood of the sacrifice on his shoulder, his cross, carrying it up the mount. And what happens? God tells Abraham not to slay his son, because now his faith has been proven. And what do they see? They see the sacrifice caught by its head in the thorns. Caught by its head in the thorns. It's amazing to me, the symbolism of this, and how the Jews missed it. Now note again, early the next morning, Abraham got up, and it was 3 days. It was the third day until they got to the place to sacrifice. For 3 days, Abraham is mourning and contemplating over the death of his firstborn son. You guessed it. God the Father thought about the death of his firstborn son. For how long? For the 3 days that he was in the tomb. In the Old Testament story, we witness an amazing exercise through which Abraham, and probably Isaac himself, was pretty passive about this, and he lays down willfully his bound, demonstrated a strong and unyielding faith in the certainty of the Lord's provision. Remember that Abraham had firmly believed that somehow the Lord would spare the boy. Because what does he say to the servants? We will worship him, and then we will come back to you. We will come back to you. He had such faith that somehow Isaac was going to be saved. Or believe it or not, the rabbis believed that he believed that Isaac was going to be raised from the dead. Which makes it even more messianic when you think about it with Jewish eyes. The lamb sacrifice. The high priest on the day of preparation would take the lamb, and he would then at 3 p.m, he would tie the ceremonial lamb, the lamb that was for all the people, and he would tie it up at the temple. And he would take the lamb, what they would do to all of the lambs is they would cut the lamb down the middle, they slit its throat to kill it quickly, they didn't want to torture it. And then they would take the lamb, and the blood had to be drained from the lamb. All the Passover lambs had to drain the blood. 250,000 lambs is a lot of blood. This is in one day, 124-hour period, the day of preparation. And what they would do is they would drain the blood by opening the cavity of the lamb and sticking a cross of wood into the chest cavity to let the blood drop. It would be hung up on a cross. And there's a tradition, I haven't been able to find the original source on this, but there is a tradition, a legend, that they would take the entrails out of the lamb because they had to eat the lamb whole, and they would then wrap them around the head of the lamb to make place for the blood to run out. The lamb would literally be on a cross with a crown on its head. And then what the high priest would do, and he did this again at the Day of Atonement, is he would put his hands over the lamb's sacrifice, and he would turn away. He would turn away because all the sins now were on that lamb, and he would say, it is finished. He did this at 3 p.m, 3 p.m, the exact time that Jesus cried out in a loud voice, it is finished, and died the sacrifice. Sacrificial blood, even the daubing of the blood on the doorpost, even that formed the cross, as you can see. The blood at the top, and then the blood at the sides, the lintels. And you can even argue the blood at the top would drip down onto the ground and formed actually a full cross. Moses, remember, he made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Remember the story in the Exodus where the people were sinning and when they were being bitten by snakes? And God told Moses to take a bronze snake and put it on a cross. And the people that looked at it, this would be the sins, their sins would be forgiven. Now what was a sin? What was a snake but the symbol of sin, because it was Satan in the garden? The sin atonement on the cross. We also know about Moses when he held up his hands. While his hands were being outstretched, the Israelites were winning the battle over the Amalekites. And you had Caleb and Joshua holding his hands outstretched as he got tired so that they would continue. His arms had to be outstretched, again, like Christ on the cross. They were told never to break the bones of the lamb. He protects all of his bones, not one of them will be broken. Again, the Messianic belief. That's why they have this unbroken lamb bone on the Passover Seder plate. But we know what happened. John tells us that at the cross, none of Jesus' bones were broken. What they did when a person was crucified, the way that they would hasten death, crucifixion, you died of asphyxiation, because eventually your lungs would fill with liquids. filled with blood, filled with water. He'd die of his feet. He's strangled to death. And these poor men would be hoisting themselves up on their tortured legs, nailed, and they would try to gain another breath. And what they would do is if they broke the legs of the crucified men, they would die quickly. And that's why they did that to the two men on either side of Jesus, because they thought it would be a sacrilege to have bodies hanging on the cross when the Feast of Unleavened Bread began at sundown. They didn't think it was a sacrilege to kill the Son of God, but they wanted to make sure he was at least taken off the cross. Well, you know what happened? They get to Jesus and he's already dead, so they don't break his legs. None of his bones were broken. But what do? He's then impaled. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Think about this. Adam's bride came from the opening in his side. Remember how does that happen? Adam's rib, God opens up Adam's side for his bride. You can argue that Christ's side was also open for us, his bride. Behold the Lamb of God. Salvador Dali was kind of wacky, but this is one of the greatest paintings of Jesus I think ever made. I love this painting. So through Jewish eyes, if you look at even things like Good Friday, now I'm sure you have your Good Friday service, and this is not a salvation issue, but when you look through Jewish eyes, something kind of wrong with this. And I'll tell you what, when you read Matthew 12, Jesus said, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Remember, they believed that if you were dead longer than 3 days, your spirit left you. Not that that was true, but that's what the Jews believed. That it demonstrated that you were dead. Here you have him saying 3 days and 3 nights. Now, if you do the math, you have Good Friday, you have Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning. What's wrong with this picture? There's no 3 days and 3 nights. It just doesn't seem to work mathematically. But if you look through Jewish eyes, remember that Palm Sunday, the day the Lamb was selected, was the 10th day of the Jewish month of Nisan. The day of preparation was 4 days later. They had to examine the lamb for 4 days and sacrifice it on the 14th day of Nisan, which was the day Christ was crucified. The lamb was sacrificed the 14th of Nisan. If you do the math, Palm Sunday was the 10th. If you count it out, the 14th of Nisan would not have been a Friday. It would have been a Thursday. And if Thursday was the day, look at it this way. Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, Olivet, Easter Sunday, the morning of, after the third day. 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb. Looking through Jewish eyes, we should be talking about Good Thursday instead of Good Friday. It's not a salvation issue, but when you're witnessing to a Jewish person, this is the kind of stuff that resonates with them. And it certainly is scriptural. Now, that perhaps, though, is why the reason we have this wrong, I would argue, is the early church lost its Jewish roots. John wrote about this. Now, it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Jesus died on the day of preparation, the next day was a special Sabbath. Gentile Christians, the church for the last 2,000 years, means, okay, it must have been a Friday because the Sabbath is always what? Saturday to the Jews. But you notice John used the word, the extra word, it was a special Sabbath. That would tell me it was a day, any day other than Friday, because Saturday was nothing special about it. It's always the Sabbath. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread, no matter what day it falls on, is always a Sabbath. It can be a Monday, it can be a Wednesday, it can be a Thursday. So when he said it was a special Sabbath, it meant that he probably wasn't crucified on Friday, because that Saturday there'd be nothing special about it. You see that? The first day of Unleavened Bread, 15 Nisan, was always considered the Sabbath, regardless of which day of the week it fell on. So through Jewish eyes, I would believe that Christ was crucified on Thursday. I want to close with this brick through a plate glass window. The cross in our bodies. Many of you may have seen this. Dr. D, I don't know if you're familiar with this from Louis Giglio. It is an amazing thing. And I want to ask you about this later, because I think this, when I saw this the first time, it just blew me away. Like I said, a brick through a plate glass window. Laminins. I have a doctor friend of mine who verified this with me. Laminins are a major family of proteins that are an integral part of the structural scaffolding for most cells and organs. Laminins are cell adhesion molecules that are found in almost every animal tissue. And they are the glue that holds one cell of our bodies to the next cell. Without them, we would literally fall apart. Here's what the physical structure of a laminin looks like. That's what it looks like. In Colossians, Paul writes the following. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things, get this, hold together. Look at this. The laminates in our body conceiving the cross of Christ. I'll close with that tonight. I want to thank you for being here tonight. To God be glory. And I hope you'll come tomorrow morning. We have Sunday school, I believe, at, what time is it tomorrow? At 9 o'clock. And then Dr. Urban's given me the privilege of giving a message during the communion where I want to talk to you about the Lord's Supper through Jewish eyes. So thank you very much for being here tonight.